Shalom and warm welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we will be discussing a very powerful and emotional film that documents the horrors of what happened in the Holocaust over 80 years ago. Warm welcome to the programme, and this week's special guest is all the way from Dorset, and her name is Marion Rice Oxley, and she's a documentary filmmaker, produced a wonderful film called I Will Not Die about the Holocaust. Marion, it's a warm welcome to the programme. It's great to have you on the programme, and I have Tim Osborne from Help the Persecuted, as well as Pastor John Hemus to thank, and as well as the Lord, for you being here today to share your remarkable testimony and your love for Israel and the Jewish people through the documentary you made. So warm welcome to the programme.
Thank you, and thank you for Tim and John as well. I'm just delighted to have the opportunity. Thank you.
Pleasure. Marion, can you just share how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ? When was your first encounter with him, and how did he change your life?
I think from the age of 7, I remember reading Lord of the Rings under the bed covers. And I was just very aware that I wanted to find some sense of bigger picture, bigger purpose, and I was aware there was a spirit realm of some sort. And couldn't find that through life in general. So when I left school, I went overland to India. It wasn't to take drugs, amazingly enough, and carried on through really trying to find, through journalism and then through working in documentaries, a way of, was there a culture, was there a topography, something that told me there was a bigger relevance. And in the search, I ended up living in places like Japan and South America and various places, just to really search. And in that search, the one thing that became really clear was there was great division about spirituality, but the things that were obvious were people were very similar. They were motivated by needing to be loved, wanting to love, wanting relationship. And every culture was different, but the people at the heart of it seemed to be the same. And roundabouts when I was 30, I'd had an on and off relationship with a guy for a number of years. I was in love with him all the time. I don't think he was very much in love with me. But eventually he came round to asking me to marry him, and there was a horrible moment when I realized he wasn't the answer. I don't think it was him that wasn't the answer. It was just it didn't fill the place on the inside that was searching. So anyway, I was just over 30. I was living in the States, and I'd worked for National Geographic and Discovery in sort of menial ways, and they put out an invitation for anyone who'd worked for them to give an idea. They were doing a 13-part, 1-hour documentary series on people who made a difference. And a friend of mine lent me the book Chasing the Dragon about Jackie Pullinger by Jackie and Andrew Quick. And it seemed perfect. So I took it to them, and they said yes. They commissioned it. But at the same time, I was talking to a friend in London, and he said, I think it would make a fantastic feature film, which I was completely out of my depth. I'd never had anything to do with feature films. But anyway, he gave me an introduction to a lady called Sarah Radcliffe at Working Title, and amazingly, she loved the book, and she gave me the chance. And so all this time, I was talking to Jackie on the phone because I needed to get the option on the rights to the book. And Jackie kept saying at the end of every conversation, and can I pray for you? And I thought, well, I need to keep her happy because I wanted to get what I wanted. And I absolutely did not believe in Jesus. But she was totally tolerant of that. She even seemed to understand. And she would pray for me, and as she prayed, it felt wonderful. There was something on the inside of me that just felt her prayer. Anyway, we got to the stage where she did grant me the option on the rights to the book and suggested I went to stay with a friend of hers before going out to Hong Kong to do the recce trip. And in going to stay with that friend really asked me to invite Jesus into my life. I thought to keep Jackie happy, I ought to. And so I did, and then she asked me if I'd like to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and I thought, oh no, everyone's going to find out now that this isn't genuine, but I better say yes, because otherwise it won't keep Jackie happy. Asked the Holy Spirit into my life, and in the middle of the night, staying with this friend of Jackie's, I woke up, and there was a half-dead daffodil in a plant, and a beam of light coming through the window onto that half-dead daffodil, and I looked at it, and at that moment I realised there was a peace inside me that I haven't had for, I could never remember, and I realised God was real, and it totally changed my life.
Amazing.
So then I went out to Jackie in Hong Kong, and there I encountered God in a dimension that it was beyond imagination. There were miracles happening, literally miracles. I mean, I guess all of life is a miracle, but one saw supernatural intervention regularly, every day, and I realised I was utterly inadequate to make either film that in any way touched on God. So happily I wasn't sued by either parties, and ended up instead working for Jackie in Hong Kong for a little bit.
Amazing. And Jackie Pullinger's doing an incredible job with heroin addicts of Hong Kong and her work she does, because my wife and I support a wonderful woman out there doing some work at the moment.
Amazing.
Which is amazing. And when did the Lord really place a love in your heart for Israel and the Jewish people?
About 4 years later, in between working for different ministries, I had a couple of months and no money. And so I was staying in an apartment that belonged to a friend who hadn't hooked up their television. And I suddenly became obsessed with reading Romans 9 to 11. And it wasn't making a huge amount of sense to me, but I couldn't stop. It was a compulsion. And at the end of the first week, I then had a sense to go and watch television, which I knew was ridiculous because it was not hooked up. But I turned it on, couldn't see a thing. But this voice, compelling voice, who turned out to be a person called Abba Eben, was talking about Israel. Following week, more Romans 9 to 11, and the same thing at the end of that week, compulsion to listen to this program, which I did. And at the end of that program, I just had a sense that I needed to go to Israel. So I found a really cheap ticket, looked up in a tourist book and found there was a dormitory in a place called the Lutheran Hostel. It isn't a dormitory anymore. Went to Israel, and when I got to Jerusalem, actually amazing intervention there, because I arrived on a Saturday morning, Shabbat, and I was thinking I'd hitch because I didn't have the money to take public transport. And someone came up to me and tapped me on the back and said they'd got a van and they were taking a group of people to the old city and they'd give me a lift. I hadn't ever met them, I've never met them since. But that got me there. I was struck with depression, quite bizarre, left my rucksack, and in leaving my rucksack I just said, God, you have to give me faith. I don't even know why I'm here. And as I was walking past a place called Christchurch in the old city, there was a lady opening up a bookshop. And I started to cry, and I asked her to sort of orientate me, if she could. And she just said, well, my name is Emunah, which means faith. And it just sort of struck me, oh, I've asked God for that. And then she said, come and have coffee with me. And we sat down, and she explained to me that she had made Aliyah, and she explained to me what that meant, immigrating to Israel as a Jewish person. And then she explained to me that she had an apartment which she shared with a friend, and the friend turned out to be the best friend of the girl that I'd worked for when I worked for Jackie in Hong Kong. So that was my starting place in staying in Israel.
That's an incredible starting place. And I mean, I remember being an 18-year-old and really touched by that film. Documentary produced by and presented by Abri Ban, Israel's finest spokesman, called Birth of a Nation, that chronologed Israel's history between the kind of mandate years all the way up until the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993.
Yes.
So it happened just before the Oslo Accords. So it was aired, it probably would have finished about 91 and just had the end of the Gulf War, but it marked Israel's challenge with her war of independence. It told the story of the building of the state after the War of Independence in 48, and then the Suez Crisis of 56, and the Six-Day War. That is probably the best ever series I've ever seen about Israel and the history of Israel. So I was hooked on that as well, which was quite extraordinary. So, but share with us how you got involved to do a documentary about Aliyah with Exodus, about bringing the Jewish people home from the former Soviet Union.
I had the opportunity of going back to Israel in 1998 and again in 99. And it was sort of emphasized, the people that I was meeting in Israel, some of them had made Aliyah very recently. And it just, the whole understanding of God really, as far as I was aware, revealing himself through having established Israel as a nation, born again in a day. And now this fulfillment of scripture, where he was saying he would bring his people back, but not necessarily, in fact, quite emphatically not knowing him, because he was the one who was going to be revealing himself in his timing to them in the land. And I was finding that those scriptures that I'd been reading was so emphasized by these ones who I was meeting. And they were talking about how much they wanted their extended families to come to Israel, and some of the hard times they were having there, some of the good times they were having. And that introduced me to a chap called Phil Hunter, who at the time, he's died now, but at the time he had an organization called Exobus, which was partnered, I think, with the Jewish Agency. And I really, because my best response to anything that moves me is to make a film, because it's my best way of telling a story, something, you know, it's testimony, but it's testimony through people who know much more about it than I do. And of course, it always leads me into being able to learn more. So it's a wonderful way of life, really. I'm very grateful for it. So I met Phil Hunter. He operated out of the UK, and he had a fleet of buses based in Eastern Europe primarily. And through his network of buses and the people that he had as volunteers, he would connect with the ones he'd been able to identify as Jewish and find for them the paperwork that endorsed their Jewishness, so that they could then make Aliyah. And I worked a little bit on the buses, sounds strange, isn't it, working on the buses, and got to make 2 or 3 sort of little documentaries, and one especially about children who are coming from orphanages. And it was staggering to me how Phil, the extent that he would go to find one Jewish child. He would befriend the head of the orphanage. He would bring gifts for every child in the orphanage. And at the end, if he had found one Jewish child who he could then bring to Israel and find a way to get them into probably a boarding school and find a family to adopt them, that their lives would be completely transformed and they would have a future with the identity they'd always been intended to have. He would do anything to do it. It was an incredible introduction.
That's incredible. And can you just share what it's like to be involved in making a documentary that is literally about the fulfilling of Bible prophecy? And we know that all the scriptures referring to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, all those prophets prophesied that the Jewish people would return back into their land and that God would bring them back from the 4 corners of the earth, which is a clear reference not to the kind of second Aliyah, but to the third Aliyah, which we've seen happen really in our day in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So what is it like working on a documentary, but meeting the people that are making Aliyah, knowing you're playing your part and seeing them fulfill Bible prophecy in the Bible become true?
It's just, the word privilege is just inadequate. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming because all of it is evidence that God is real. And somehow or other, even though I believe, it takes it deeper and deeper. And the opportunity, in a way, of coming alongside those lives and the opportunity of, in some way, sharing that depth of experience of the reality of God proved through his prophecy. And having the possibility that goes through the screen and reaches other people and is the evidence of God is amazing. I don't know how else to put it. Amazing is an inadequate word. You know what I mean? It's like so fulfilling. Absolutely.
And Marion, I have to ask you, and I'm sure our viewers are curious as well, how did you get into kind of filmmaking, and how did this become the passion of your life, to tell other people's story through the lens of a documentary film?
It was a total stumble. It was simply because I wanted to know what was the meaning of life. And so it struck me as a journalist, I would have the opportunity of going and asking questions of other people and possibly going to other cultures, which is where I thought I would actually find God, if there was such a thing. And then I found that I worked for a while for the travel department of the Daily Telegraph. and for an incredibly sympathetic lady who understood that really my goal was nothing to do with working for the aforementioned. And so as a result, she constantly was trying to get me out onto commissions that would take me to the places that I wanted to go to explore spirituality. And then the better way seemed to be to actually work on film. And I apprenticed, I would call it, with a chap called Mike Rosenberg. He had a company called Partridge Films, and this is prehistory, really. And in all of that, of course, none of the questions really got answered. I got to meet some very, very special people, but I wasn't getting to explore the spirituality that I was really longing to find. But at the same time, it was training me in the art, as I saw it through other people, of really being able to tell other people's stories, and at the same time get involved very rapidly to a point where one was around the people who had the most knowledge or the most understanding, and most especially important for me, where they were living what they were doing from their hearts. They weren't doing it for circumstances, they were doing it because it connected with who they were.
And tell us a story behind your documentary, I Will Not Die, which is a moving documentary, also set to music as well. And we'll see extracts of it later. But really, how you wanted to make a powerful, moving film about the Holocaust, but doing it in a way that you are giving a voice to those children who perished in that Nazi concentration camp just outside Prague in Czechoslovakia. Terezin, and also the way that you wanted to kind of tell this story. So how did you get involved in making a documentary about the Holocaust?
Yes. Stumbled again. It was Ruth Fazal, who is the composer of Oratorio Terezin. She heard, I was in Toronto, and she had heard from mutual friends that I was very excited about Israel. I loved going there, loved being there. And so she had just been given a book about poetry and art created by children who had been in the ghetto of Terezin during the Second World War. And she didn't really have a context for it, but she understood that these children were something to do with Israel because they were Jewish, but she didn't know particularly what. So that may be wrongly expressing that. So we got to know each other really through her questions about Israel, and I found her questions started questions in me. It was great friendship, exploring the Bible, exploring what was the connection between these children, what was happening, what had been prophesied, what were the prospects, all of that. And as Ruth started herself to respond, she would say her first language, I think she would say her first language is music, her first language of response. She started on the computer to write little songs to go with music to go with the poetry. That was how it began. And as she wrote that, I just felt something on the inside of me when she was playing back phrases from her computer, and this was 2001. And in response to that, I thought, oh, I've got to tell this story. There's something on this music. I don't understand it, but there's something that is compelling. So I just started to film. To record and to film, and it developed into a 7-year project.
Incredible. 7 years is also a long time. So let's have a special treat for our viewers. And if you haven't seen the documentary, I Will Not Die, here's an extract from it.
As I looked at the pictures and read the poetry of the children in the ghetto of Terezin, I really felt that I wanted to somehow respond.
I knew very little about the Holocaust. And I knew nothing about Terezin, which was the context that this was all set in.
I ended up writing a piece for children's choir, adult choir, soloists, orchestra, called Oratorio Terezin. These poems, they really did touch a deep place in me. Now, I'm not Jewish, but somehow it took me on a journey into these children's lives. I suppose music is my first language when it comes to expressing what I'm feeling on the inside. And I was actually sitting with my violin one day, and I found myself just kind of playing this figure. Da, 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 da.
Every time you wake up, what you think is of being transported and being killed. So that was the greatest fear. A boy who was in Terezin called Michael Flach wrote this poem. The heaviest wheel rolls across our foreheads to bury itself deep somewhere inside our memories.
The most horrible thing was the transports. We call them transport to the east, or the calling to the east. But then we didn't know about Auschwitz. There was always a strong belief in life.
Terezin was architecturally designed as a fortress town. The room that I lived on was on the second floor. We slept on 3 bunk beds, 3-layer bunk beds, 2 to each bed, 40 of us. I don't think there was any soap at all, and hardly any water to wash. That's where we slept, that's where we ate, with hardly ever going outside of that building.
We children tried to live our life.
Painting was done mostly by women, you know, most of the boys, we wrote poetry.
You say paint, so you have in your mind and pencil and colors. Somebody had to steal a pencil somewhere. I was 14 at the time I made this painting.
When I saw Edna's painting in the book, I felt that this so wonderfully depicts what the oratorio is about. The little boat is the child. The candle is off to the side, and you're thinking, is the boat going to move towards the light, or is it going to be ever found in this place of darkness, which is depicted on the painting?
And I'm sure that you will agree with me. Just watching a small bit of that extract of the documentary, I Will Survive, I Will Not Die, sorry, is an indicating, it almost takes you back to that ghetto in Terezin and how the children would have felt. Now, how did you go about making this documentary? Because it's a very, very powerful documentary. We just showed a small extract there just then, and that's really, really powerful. And what moves me is the fact that you are telling the Holocaust survivors' stories, but you're playing it to music. You're bringing the poems and the songs of the children that were in the ghetto alive as well. And it's a different way of communicating the horrors of the Holocaust in a kind of very artistic, sophisticated, but also a very moving and powerful way.
No original vision. Literally responded to what I felt was so powerful about the sound of the music. For me, there was something on the music, and it was something that made my spirit feel really alive and moved. And as Ruth, in a way, developed her own exploration, she was just incredibly generous. She let me be alongside for meeting the Holocaust survivors that she was meeting, for working with the children when they were coming to try out for the children's choir. Just in every way, she let me be really alongside her growing discovery and her expression of response through the music that she was writing. And I just filmed everything that moved and some things that didn't.
So tell us about Ruth Faisal, the composer. I mean, how did you meet her? We can see in the documentary that she has a passion and love for Israel and the Jewish people. She says she's a Gentile, and obviously wanted to communicate the horrors of what happened at that Nazi concentration camp in Czechoslovakia.
So I just simply met her in Toronto, and she was asking, she was wanting to find out more about Israel as a context for this book that she was finding herself so moved by, of the children's poetry and art from Terezin. And so we met then, and she started asking me questions about Israel, and that allowed me to begin to really get to know her, and that's how the friendship developed.
Amazing. And what were her thoughts when you said that you wanted to do a documentary, following her in Canada and then to Europe, and then finally in Israel as well?
She was so gracious. She understood that what I was moved by was the musical response, and both of us are believers, believe in Jesus, and so she could see that I was moved by the music, and I think the friendship meant that we were coming from a place of trust. And I wanted to make a film about the story of the music, and for me it wasn't a story about Ruth, although of course indistinguishable in as much as she's the composer. But for me there was something that, as I experience it, God was putting on the music He was giving her to compose. And so that was the story she allowed me, she allowed me with great grace and generosity to follow that story. Amazing.
So how did you connect? Because it seems quite complicated, but you've done it in a very simplistic way, which is great, and that's what's always so good about very, very good documentaries, is that they're complex, and yet they're kind of simple when you watch them, and it's kind of simple format. Why did the orchestra play such a huge part? And from there, you're able to build the Holocaust survivors into that. You're able to bring in the children who sung the songs and read out the poetry that was linked to these children of Terezin who were actually in that concentration camp at the time, to put it all together.
I'm not sure that I see the focal point as the orchestra. I think I see it as the music. And the orchestra, maybe I'm sort of nitpicking, as the orchestra being the ones that delivered that sound. And of course, the orchestra changed. It was one orchestra in Canada, in Toronto. It was another one in Bratislava. And actually, I used the Bratislavan one as the soundtrack because they have different agreements. And each orchestra, the one, for instance, in Israel, another orchestra again, but each of them were able to communicate this same extraordinary connection I felt between God, in a sense, revealing Himself through the music and through the soloist and through the choirs. It was the music, for me, that was really delivering the connection with God. And then part of my own testimony and hopefully what happened sometimes on camera, I had a camera with me just all the time, so I was filming everything I was experiencing. And as the Holocaust survivors would allow me to have a camera on them as they talked about their experience and answered questions, I could also see the places some of the time where they would connect. And that was a very, very moving and powerful thing. And then with the children who were in the choir, you know, over the years, the ones who actually travelled to each place, each performance, seeing how they were getting more and more, they were internalising what they were singing. And as they did that, they were beginning to even dare to believe. One of them said, could this have even been his suffering, God's suffering, as well as the suffering of the people who were going through these appalling experiences and the ones who survived? So for me, the putting together the documentary was something that became almost a personal testimony of what had impacted me in a sort of chronological form. And it seemed right to complete it in the performances in Israel. That's where it seemed for me, for the documentary, to actually be at a jump-off point to the hope that God has through the nation of Israel, through the people he's bringing back to live there, all of that. Actually, Ruth took it on to the Carnegie Hall where it was performed in 2007, and that would be a whole other story. But the one that completed in the final performance in Jerusalem for me was the PowerPoint for the documentary.
Amazing. Almost sounds very, very similar to the whole format of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. I mean,
Yes.
It starts off in the kind of pre-war years, the Jewish community, First World War, and then builds up in the 1930s with the rise of fascism and Nazism across the continent of Europe, and then, of course, the Shoah and the horrors that went through the Holocaust.
Yes.
And then you end with this really bright view
Yes.
of the forests around Jerusalem that comes through and shines through the museum. So almost seems as if that's the journey that you've been in, from that darkness of being in Europe and of course on the continent of Europe under Nazi occupation, and then the light, which was the Jewish state. So that's quite amazing. But Marion, I just want to focus a little bit on the concentration camp. This Nazi concentration camp was Terezin in Czechoslovakia, 30 miles from Prague. And I didn't know anything about this concentration camp. So has your documentary brought this to life and the horrible stories that are told there from the survivors who survived it to a large audience?
Terezin, in fact, I mean, it's tricky to condense this down to a couple of minutes. Terezin was not really what would be called a concentration camp. I think the Jewish people would call it a ghetto, really. Yeah. And it was a very strange, it had very strange purpose. It was used even to try and persuade the Red Cross during the war that the Jewish people were being looked after well by the Nazi regime. So it had a facade aspect to it. And I think the conditions there, I need to be really careful about what I say, because any of those conditions were utterly appalling and inhumane. But I think maybe people like Edna and Johnny on the film would perhaps say that the conditions there were very much less awful than the ones they experienced in Mauthausen and Auschwitz.
Absolutely. So let's have a look now at the second part of this documentary called I Will Not Die.
He died when he was 14, this boy, so very difficult. My brother and I were two of the 15,000 children sent to Terezin. I was one of the 100 that survived. My brother was one of the 14,900 who did not. The fear of dying is the worst thing. You can put up with hunger, you can put up sleeplessness, you can put up with everything, but even the fear of being killed is so ingrained in us that that's the worst thing, and especially if it's with you all the time.
People walk along the street to see at once on each you in the ghetto. This evil and of fear.
You lived, you died, it depended. not on you, not on what you want it to.
A prayer of mine had always been, God, I want to know your heart. And I think in some ways that this book of poetry in my hands was the beginning of the answer to that prayer. I was feeling to take some of these poems and weave them together with the Hebrew scriptures. If I was going to incorporate the Hebrew scriptures with this, then I was going to need an adult voice, an adult response to the place of suffering, that response that says, God, where are you? Have you forsaken us? I found that I was also needing a voice of the prophet, because a lot of what I was choosing as parts of the scripture were from the prophets. Sort of hearing this very high voice, this high female voice that would somehow weave in and out of the piece, sometimes singing with the prophet, sometimes with God, sometimes with the children. The voice of suffering, whether it was our suffering, the suffering of humanity, or whether it was the suffering of God. What I was finding in the scriptures that I was bringing was that God was portrayed as the lover, and he was the one that was calling his people back to himself. And so I felt, well, if you're going to portray the lover in music, the tenor is always the lover.
One incident that I remember very vividly, when a group of kids my age were with some help from somebody, were allowed to go just outside of the ghetto. The ghetto was completely paved, no grass. So once we were permitted to go outside on the grass and play in the grass, we played games, word games. And that day, I always remember the joy of seeing grass, of seeing butterflies, of seeing nature. Well, just a few feet, maybe just 10 feet outside of the ghetto, but the joy was immense to be in nature, to realize what it could be to be like free.
We just can't believe what those children would have gone through at that ghetto in Czechoslovakia, and to think that they were reflecting how they were feeling through songs and poems and pictures to express their feelings, which is wonderfully portrayed in this powerful documentary. Marion, I did a bit of research, as I do for all my programmes, because I didn't know very much at all about, I didn't know anything about this ghetto called Terezin. But according to the notes I read here, that the Nazis sent 150,000 or approximately around that kind of number of people, and around 15,000 were Jewish, and they were there for months or not years before then being sent by trains to their death camps at Treblinka and Auschwitz, Birkenau, and it's roughly believed that only 150 survived. So it must have been a real privilege to interview the survivors, to tell their story, and what you're doing is telling their story, but to a bigger audience that don't know anything about what happened at this ghetto called Terezin. Extraordinary. So what was your thoughts when you interviewed the survivors, these child survivors of the ghetto?
I think Edna Amit, who we've seen in the clips, she was a perfect example. I met her in Israel with her husband and with her extended family, children and grandchildren.
Amazing.
How amazing, eh? And she treated me as an honoured guest, and honestly, I felt so utterly out of my depth to meet someone who had survived what she'd survived. Part of her story was that she had come from a family that did believe in God, and then at 14 she'd seen a baby being used for target practice, and I realised as she told me her story, I had absolutely no resource inside me to be able to realise what her experiences had been. And at that moment, I was very surprised to find that the thought that came up inside me was Isaiah 53. And I realized, wow, I don't, but God does. And I think for me, the experience, the privilege of being allowed to even be with these people. I mean, really, I can't put it in a more extreme way. I really can't, that they would allow me into their lives. And that they would be willing to share things that are unimaginable, the places it took them to themselves on the inside. And the only way I found that I could actually even sit and listen was being aware of the fact that the reality of the God I believe in is that He was alongside. He was there with them.
Because when you look at this, I've covered enough programs on the show of the Holocaust. It's very dark. It really does refer, and when we discuss this subject, it goes to the darkest chapter in Jewish history. The fact that over 6 million precious Jewish lives were murdered on an industrial scale by the Nazis, which wasn't that long ago, 80 years ago, maybe two generations ago, where my grandfather would have fought for the freedom of Europe, to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny and the destruction on the Jewish people, and how this satanic ideology was centered on Jew hatred and murdering the Jews. So we knew it went beyond kind of human thinking. This was demonically driven. And yet, today when we reflect on this and the questions many Jewish people who went through the Holocaust says, well, where was God in this? Where was He when we were suffering like this? And the fact that the Jewish people have a special plan and a purpose in God's sight, that He hasn't rejected them, and He's got a purpose. And what is so remarkable is that we go, don't we, from the darkest chapter in Jewish history to one of the brightest chapters in Jewish history within the space of 3 years, just 3 years of the Holocaust ending. Only virtually the entire Jewish population of Europe wiped out, and yet out of the ashes we see the modern state of Israel being born.
Yeah, completely.
How important is it to convey that in the film, but also as Christians to convey God's love for His people, to know that they're not alone, that despite what they went through, God still has a special plan, a special purpose. They're not rejected. And if we read our Bibles, we know that God has a real love for the Jewish people.
Well, I wish I'd said what you just said. That was completely, I think, the heart of the purpose, in a way, behind the documentary. I think it really, for me, the purpose of the documentary, I realized when I came to the end of filming it, and of course during the process of of Ruth composing the music, for me it was something, the music and the Hebrew scriptures so wonderfully expressed, as far as I understand, that God never ever wanted to abandon his people or chose to, and that he has consistently loved them. I just feel the Hebrew scriptures are so clear on this. And to have the opportunity of, in some way, having those scriptures with music that seems to communicate his heart. It's the tenor who sings the voice of God. And that really is a sort of a wooing, loving voice, you know, a wooing, loving pitch. The whole thing, I think, the whole of the documentary, the whole of Oratorio Terezin, is really to ultimately bring the viewer to the place of realizing this God loves the Jewish people. He sees them as his, and he wants them to know he never left them, he never abandoned them. He wants them to know his love for them, and that it's his word that is being fulfilled in the Jewish state, having become Israel, the nation, and he is faithful to it.
Amen.
He's faithful.
I mean, what's so moving is, I mean, we saw in one of the previous extracts of your documentary being played there, this poem says, "The world is a bloom and seems to smile. I want to fly, but where, how high? If in barbed wire things can bloom, why can't I? I will not die." And that just really sums up the pure frustration and the evil that was all around these Jewish people, saying, well, why are we here? Why can't I be free? Why can't I do what I want to do? Why do I have to be detained? Why do we have to be in this ghetto surrounded by Nazi security guards and dogs and barbed wire? And why are we hated so much?
Yes.
And yet you convey that so powerfully through this documentary. But can you talk about the success afterwards? Because you've featured this documentary at a Jewish film festival, I think the Toronto Film Festival in 2009, and then it was also aired on Israeli television as well to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day.
It was an absolute dream. Amazing that Israel's Channel 1 and then subsequently Channel 2 aired it, as you say, on their Holocaust Memorial Day schedule. Just phenomenal that they would do that. And I think that's a testimony, again, to the music. Of course, it's a testimony, too, to the fact it was Jewish children who wrote those poems and created that art. But somehow, that music carries something like the Israeli ambassador in Prague, at the time that performance was there, came up to Ruth afterwards, and he just said, "I didn't want it to end. It's like life from the dead." So there was something about that music that resonated to him as well. And other Jewish people, I mean, of course I've met a lot of Jewish people subsequently who've listened to it, and part of the amazing thing I think about the Jewish people, the ones that I've met anyway, and the survivors, is they're willing to consider this music, to hear it, and allow it to be what it is to them, and they have all pretty much all said that somehow it resonates in a real place inside them, and it leaves them in a place of hope. And so the music itself seems to carry the hope that I think has been realized in part in the nation of Israel now, having been, you know, born again in a day. There is the nation. It's got 7 million Jewish people living in it. There's you know, all that nation is achieving. But what does that mean in terms of how it's fulfilling God's heart and evidence of him actually able to be faithful to his word? And where's that going to take us? How exciting.
Oh, absolutely. Which leads me on really, as we're coming to the end of the programme, Ruth, to say, what is the response to the documentary? Because clearly God was communicating through this very powerful documentary film that you produced, that despite the darkest hour that the Jewish people went through, despite that period of history where they had no hope, where it felt like the whole Jewish community across Europe would face annihilation, and yet God was still with them. And as Christians, he wants us to show his love to his Jewish people, and he hasn't forgotten the blood that was shed, the innocent blood, the Jewish blood, the blood of his people shed on the continent of Europe over 80 years ago.
The response at the Toronto Film Festival, Jewish Film Festival, and others subsequently, Jewish film festivals, was one of hope. One of hope and huge grace towards me, towards Ruth, towards anyone involved in anything, to actually show some degree of identification and support of the Jewish people, which is so generous with our history as believers, Christians, towards the Jewish people. It's just amazing, and the music seems to carry that sense of hope, which has to be supernatural. You know, it's very difficult to see hope when the limitations are just what's happening in the world and circumstances. But there is something in that music, and something I think in the creativity behind what enabled those children to write those poems and create that art under those circumstances. There's something in all of it that I think speaks of the heart of God, and that He really is alive and hasn't forgotten them or us.
And of course, our generation face another challenge today, that you know, we can look back and say that what happened with the Holocaust was 80 years ago. You know, that's a different time, that's a different era. But today, sadly, we are seeing hatred against God's people, the nation of Israel. We're seeing a rise of Jew hatred to the scale and the levels we haven't seen since the 1930s and the 1940s. Yes, it's different. It's not coming from top down, from state level or government level, but it's more coming up from the grassroots. That's an imperative that as Christians we learn the lessons from the Holocaust, that we speak up against Jew hatred, and we reassure our Jewish friends that we love them, that we're there for them, we're going to care for them, and we're going to speak up for them. And that really is a very powerful message that needs to be conveyed, isn't it?
I agree. I completely agree. And obviously, as a filmmaker, one's got a wonderful opportunity to be telling the stories that I would say tell the truth. And for me, essentially, if I'm allowed to make a story about the testimony of someone who has gone through something, a Jewish person who has gone through something and has overcome and is now standing for what their life now is, I see that as an amazing opportunity to break the paradigms, to break the propaganda, and to actually allow people through the media of television or however it's broadcast to actually encounter a real person who is clearly not how they've been presented to be.
All right, for those watching the programme today that have been inspired by this conversation, Marion, especially for you and what you've done through this documentary, how can they come to watch it?
YouTube. I'm so grateful for YouTube.
So all you have to do is type in I Will Not Die documentary or film, and you can watch the whole film on YouTube as well, which is wonderful because you made this freely available to everyone as well. So can you share with us some of your kind of next projects or next ideas that you've got? Because you know, to make a documentary that is so powerful about the Holocaust, involving music and also featuring the survivors as well, that's so powerful and so incredible.
I'm hoping to have the opportunity of telling some stories about the difference that people are making actually in Israel. So John Hamus, Pastor John Hamus, who you interviewed a while back, is going to be working, I think, doing some work for Magen David Adom in Israel. And I would really like to have the opportunity to go and film what he's going to be doing, so that the story of his heart, his passion for Israel, his understanding of God's heart for that nation and those people can be told through the reality of what he and his construction team are going to be doing in the land.
Amazing, yeah, I'll have to get him on and once he filmed that to show extracts on the Middle East Report. Marion, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report today, and thank you so much for making this very powerful documentary about the Holocaust. And I want to thank you for watching at home today. And it's a difficult subject, we know, discussing the Holocaust, but when it's put to music, it's even more powerful, especially when it gives a voice to those children who perished in the Holocaust, particularly at the Terezin concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, that this gives them a voice and a hope, and also reassures the Jewish people that the horrors they went through over 80 years ago, as Christians we will stand up for them and fight against Jew hatred, which ultimately leads to destruction of the Jewish people, destruction of our Western civilization, and that's why it's vital that we stand up against this evil that is Jew hatred. So I want to thank you so much for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.